Hey folks, welcome to week one of DMD400, audio and video for the web. All right, so this is our first week, but there's a lot to cover. We've already covered the introduction to the course and gone through everything in Canvas and sort of how the course is going to operate. So now we're going to start diving into some more specifics. Back in week zero, you guys got an email about how to sort of get ready for the class. Week zero, of course, being the week before classes start. And so I had asked you to really familiarize yourself with the Canvas site, read through the Tools, and More Tools handout for this class, which is the list of digital tools that we are using specifically for the class for our motion graphics projects and for our podcasting projects. And of course, to download, set up, and plan access to Adobe After Effects, Photoshop, Illustrator, as well as GarageBand, Anchor, YouTube, and SoundCloud. It's a lot to do. Bear in mind that if you are on a PC, you can certainly use something other than GarageBand. You can use Adobe Audition, you can use Audacity, whatever works for you. So this should all be done by now, so that works out nicely. All right, next, let's take a look at the week one overview. Now again, we did the introduction to class already, so what are we specifically getting into this week? Well, the main thing is we're going to take an overview look at Adobe After Effects. It's a very complex program, so we are going to try to break it down into as simple an understanding as possible. We're going to look at the workspace, the tools, and the panels. We'll compare it to Adobe Photoshop in terms of complexity, and we'll go from there. There's also a whole bunch of consumables this week, so lots of textbook reading, as it were. As you know from my classes, I don't have textbooks, but I do have a lot of consumables. This class specifically has a lot of them. So let's talk about sort of the basic layout of this. Every other week, we will be focusing on Adobe After Effects. In the opposite weeks, we'll be working on our podcasting projects. But on the weeks that have Adobe After Effects at the top of the title for the overview, this week is After Effects Basics, and then 2 weeks from now will be After Effects something else, and then 2 weeks from then something else, and so on and so forth. Each week that has an After Effects heading has a bunch of consumable videos from a set of After Effects lessons that we are going to be using. This is our main textbook for our motion graphics projects and in learning Adobe After Effects. Now, I always say that the best way to learn software is to sort of play around with it, but Adobe After Effects is complex enough that you really have to follow some linear steps in learning the software. And so I have each of these training videos laid out in the order in which they're supposed to be watched, okay? So this first one here, what is Adobe After Effects? Then we have a video that goes over the main panels, the settings, etc. Now, each week that we do After Effects, I will also be doing a video showing you sort of my version of these things or going over some specific details about the projects we're going to work on or whatever. But these videos here are really your important textbook reading. So make sure you take time during the week to watch through each of these and then practice each of the elements that are being covered in these videos in Adobe After Effects. Lots of practice, right? Lots of practice on the piano with these things, as it were. You got to do your scales, you got to practice. So there's a lot of time set aside during the week for these things. So you'll notice that this week there's really not a lot going on other than learning these basics of After Effects. Now, we do have two other consumables this week outside of that, and that is Animation Basics and All About Storytelling. You do have to read through these this week. In fact, I'm going to go over them with you in a minute, but you don't have to have these mastered this week. We're going to be using these skills throughout the semester, and so this is just an introduction to them, and these can be sort of your pocket guides to refer back to in terms of basics of animation and storyboarding. We won't actually be doing any storyboarding for a little while, but I wanted to introduce these early because there's a good amount to digest, okay? Okay, so let's go from there. So again, remember, you're going to digest these handouts, Animation Basics and All About Storytelling, read through them, get to know them. This is just going to be your first pass on them. The most important thing this week, of course, is to go through each of these videos, practice with them in After Effects, and really start to get to know the software doing these very basic things, okay? Now, in addition to that, we are launching our first project. It's a very simple and small After Effects motion graphics project. It is Project 1. We're going to take a look at that in a second to see what that's all about. So let's go from there, okay? All right, so next, let's hop right into Adobe After Effects and just kind of like get the lay of the land, as it were. Okay, so here we are over in Adobe After Effects. So when you first open it up, it does have a similar welcome screen here to what you see with a lot of the Adobe products. It gives you a chance to start a new project, open an existing project. It also gives you access to some tutorials and other training type videos. These are different than the training videos that we have in our syllabus in our week to week. So if you want to get some additional information, if you're the sort of person that really just likes to consume a whole ton of tutorials, you can get more directly from Adobe from within the program. So these are pretty great. But the main thing we're going to do here is just kind of get to know the workspace. So to do that, we have to start a new project. So we'll just click the new project button. And unlike, say, Photoshop or Illustrator, it doesn't ask you to name your project or give it any specifications or anything like that. It just sort of gets you right into the software. So let's tour around the software for a minute here and just sort of talk about what we have in terms of areas. Now, After Effects looks very complex, and it is very complex. But similar to Photoshop, there is a lot of functionality built into Adobe After Effects that, as a beginner, as somebody who's just learning to do some motion graphics, you don't need to know all of it. In fact, you could be using Adobe After Effects for many years and still not know all of it. In that way, it is very similar to Photoshop. When I introduce Photoshop to students, I always say that Photoshop is designed to be used in a variety of different ways for a variety of different purposes by different types of users, different types of designers, artists, photographers, 3D graphics people, whatever. And so as such, there are a number of tools and techniques and functionality within Photoshop that you as an introductory user might never get to. Or maybe it's just that you're not going to work in that area. Maybe you're not a photographer. And so you won't use all of those options. Maybe you're never going to do 3D modeling, so you won't use those types of options. So Photoshop is similar to After Effects in that way. Now, Adobe After Effects is a motion graphics piece of software, and it allows you to work with video. Now, one thing to understand about Adobe After Effects is that it is meant to be used for relatively short pieces of video. Meaning that if you were going to edit an entire movie, right, a 2-hour movie, and you were going to edit the movie as film editors do, right, you would not use Adobe After Effects for that. You would use something like Final Cut Pro or Adobe Premiere. Those programs are video editing programs that are meant to be used for longer pieces of video, to edit it in a way that helps tell the narrative that is clear and concise and moves things around and adds some basic effects and those sorts of things. After Effects, on the other hand, is meant to really be kind of a motion equivalent to graphic design. What do I mean by that? Well, if you think about the combination of typography and image or video, and that is a composition, that is a graphic design composition that is used for a variety of things such as title sequences or graphics over sporting events or credits running at the end of a film or presentations for corporate purposes or nonprofit companies or whatever. Anywhere where you see video and still imagery meshed with typography and special effects, and then of course you throw in sound effects and music, that's really what After Effects is for. So you wouldn't need those types of tools for a 2-hour piece of video, right? So instead you would use it for elements of video that are much smaller or shorter. And so just to put it simply, After Effects is for shorter pieces of video, and something like Adobe Premiere or Apple Final Cut Pro is for longer pieces of video. Okay, so now that we understand that, let's talk about the workspace. So the workspace is broken down into multiple sections, and the workspace is a little different than what we would see in Photoshop because, of course, we're not working on sort of digital artboards. We're instead working on video, and so we have to have a place to watch the video. We have to have a place to progress through the video, and, of course, we have to have access to our media and our tools, right? So let's talk about what we've got. So over here on the left-hand side in Adobe After Effects, we have the first, let's call it, section of the workspace, and it's highlighted in blue here, outlined in blue, so you can see this. And this is where your media lives, okay? So whatever is going to be in your composition, whether it be photographs or video clips or pieces of audio, sound effects, music, whatever, you are going to drag and drop those from your file browser into here. Now I have nothing here yet, obviously. We are just sort of going over the areas, but that's where it would live. And you can see that it's just sort of like a little organizational system. It will list the item by name and then by type. So if it's a JPEG or a PNG or a MOV file or an MP3 or whatever, you can organize it either way. So you can organize them alphabetically by clicking on the arrows to organize them that way via the name, or you can organize them by type, right? And the next column is a little bit of information about it. So this is where you will drag and drop all your, we'll call them assets, things that could possibly live in your composition. Even if you're not sure if you're going to use a particular photograph or piece of music or video chunk or whatever, just drag it over there. You have it. It's just like sort of getting your collection of stuff together. And there's ways to organize them like we just talked about. If you decide you don't want one, you can highlight it and hit the old trash can down here. And of course, if your list is really long, you'll be able to scroll through it and just sort of see all the stuff you put in there. And then down here, you can use some of these buttons at the bottom to help organize them further. You can make folders. So if you want to put things into folders just to help keep yourself organized, that is a good way to go as well. So this panel here, this section, is your assets and where all your media goes. Okay, next. The next panel is this one here in the upper middle, again outlined in blue now. This is where your composition is going to live, and you can see here there's a new composition button that I can click, which we'll get to in a second. This is basically your view screen. So this is meant to replicate a television screen or a video screen or a movie theater or whatever, where you can watch the video go by in front of you and therefore make adjustments to it. Now you can access some of the assets this way, but this is going to be your view screen. So whatever's happening on the view screen is referred to in After Effects language as a composition, okay? And really, if you think about graphic design terms, if you were designing a poster for a circus or something, and you were putting some type and some photographs and a bunch of other information on there, and maybe some illustrations or a graphic, that also is a composition, right? It's composing together a bunch of different elements into a finished product. So that makes sense that they would call this a composition. The difference, of course, between, say, doing something in Photoshop or Illustrator is that here the composition moves, right? Because it's video, whereas there, those are still images. They're not going anywhere. Okay, so that's the central panel. Next, this panel over here on the far right is a collection of tools. Now, as you see, as I click through them, they fold open and fold closed as I go through the list. There's a whole number of them, right? And you can adjust which ones you're seeing by going up to the window pull down in the file menu, just like you do in Photoshop. But some of these will look familiar to you, like for example, the Align palette. That is pretty much the exact same palette that is used in Photoshop and Illustrator that allows you to align objects certain ways. The Character palette, this gives you all of your typographic tools for when you're dealing with type and letter forms. This is very similar to the Character palette you see in Adobe Illustrator or Photoshop. And then, of course, its sister palette is the Paragraph palette, which also deals with typography. You're also going to see some other palettes here that maybe you're not familiar with that are sort of specific to Adobe After Effects, like there is the audio mixing palette right here. There is the effects and presets palette, which we're going to be using a lot of here. The whole point of After Effects, as the name kind of implies, is to create compositions using typography and images and video, but to do so in a way that really kind of leverages what we'll generally refer to as special effects. Now, I'm not necessarily saying we're going to like set things on fire or blow things up or, you know, those types of special effects, but I'm just talking about effects that you can add to moving images that will give it a certain type of story, right? So you're not just showing the video, but you're adding things to it. And so this effects and presets panel allows you to access a whole bunch of different ones that are categorized by type. So later on, we'll be playing around with a bunch of these and seeing how they work. Most of them work by simply choosing one from the pull-down menu and then dragging and dropping it from the effects panel over to the asset that is in your composition screen. So that's pretty nice, right? There's other ways to make effects, which we'll get to later, but this is sort of a nice collection of sort of pre-built effects and presets that we can play around with. And just because they're pre-built doesn't mean you can't edit them. You can certainly edit them. And there's a bunch of other tools over here too, including some painting tools, some brush tools. Yes, there are brush tools. You can use the brush tool as well as the paint tool to go ahead and do some painting on the screen if you need to, and there's a few other things. And then the info button up top will give you sort of specifications on whatever object happens to be active over here. Now these panels, these tool panels, are augmented up here by these selections of types of tool panels. I like to keep the All Panels button chosen because that literally gives me, as the name implies, all the panels. Since they fold up and fold down, they don't really get in the way. And even if you're working on a laptop that's smaller, they still fold up pretty nicely. But you'll see that there's some other options here for styles of panels, including one for small screen. So if you are on a particularly small laptop, like a 12 or 13-inch laptop, you might want to switch over to the small screen configuration to give yourself a little more room to work. Okay, now before we leave this upper section here, let's go up to the very top of the After Effects panel, and then right across the top here, it's almost hidden. This is our collection of tools. So these are tool panels, right? These are actual individual tools. Now I know you're used to seeing the toolbox in Photoshop and Illustrator running down the left side of the screen, but that's not how it works here in After Effects. In After Effects, it's a thin line of tools that just runs along the top. There are not as many tools in After Effects as there are in those other programs, and they do have some embedded tools, whereas if you click and hold on it for a second, it'll open up into a fold-out menu and show you some related tools. Now these are grayed out right now because I don't have a composition up and running yet, but just you can sort of see what they are. There's the selection arrow. You know what that is. You saw that in Photoshop and Illustrator. There's the hand tool, there's the magnifying tool, the zoom tool. So all of those are very familiar to you. But then there's also an orbiting tool that allows you to move around a three-dimensional object. There's a pan tool, which allows you to move up and down in a video space. There's a dolly tool, which is also sort of a camera adjustment tool. So those are new just for After Effects, and we'll get to know those later. There's the rotation tool, that's pretty standard. There's a pan behind tool, which again is a camera-based tool. But then we get into some more familiar tools that you should know about. There are the shape tools, the rectangle tool, and then underneath that are some other shape tools that will look familiar to you. We have the pen tool, along with some associated pen tools, again, similar to what you see in Illustrator and Photoshop. And the typography tool, the type tool. It has a bunch of different configurations, but it's very similar to the ones we've seen. There's that paintbrush tool, which of course ties into the brush and paint palettes. There's a clone stamp tool, just like the clone stamp tool in Photoshop. There's an eraser tool, which you should be familiar with. A roto brush tool, which is a new tool here, and then a puppet position pin tool, which is for helping to animate some objects. So there's some different tools that you're not familiar with, but then there's a bunch of tools that you're like, oh, I know what those do. So sort of leverage kind of your previous knowledge from some of the Adobe products and just play around with them. Okay, so now let's leave the upper half of the workspace and go down to the lower chunk of the workspace here. And this lower chunk is a combination of two panels that work together. So you'll notice when I click on it, it highlights the entire thing, outlines the whole thing in blue at the bottom, even though it's in two sections. So from here over, this is going to be your layers palette, right? This is going to be all of the objects that you drag from your assets palette, from your media palette up here, that you drag down to here to the layers palette, or you drag over here to the compositions screen, and then it starts building them in layers, just like in Photoshop. Now, the layers palette doesn't work exactly like it does in Photoshop, but it's the same concept. If the layer is at the top of the list, well, then it's closest to us in space. Remember the X, Y, and Z axis, right? So it will be closest to you in space. The further down the list of items in your layers palette, the further away they are from you in space. So that's all the same. So if you pick the items up and rearrange them, well, then you're rearranging the order they're in space. So that's good. There's also ways to sort of tag and organize them up at the top. And then you'll see once we start putting in layers in the next area that you'll see that there's ways to control them. Now, once you add an item, it gets what's called an associated timeline. Now, the right section of this is the timeline. And so you put in an object, and then it has a time that it exists on the screen over a given amount of time, basically. And so that goes from the beginning to the end, and you can adjust how long the item lives on the screen, when it first appears on the screen, when it disappears from the screen. Pretty basic stuff. Okay, so that's the workspace. That's really it. Now, I know there's a lot more to it than that, but you should really just be familiar with these basic panels. So we have, again, your media, your composition panel, your tool palettes are over here, the actual tools themselves are up top, and then over here we have your layers section, and then the associated timeline that goes with each layer. Okay, in a second we'll come back and we're going to start up a new composition and just drop in some assets and sort of see how that works. Okay, so now we're ready to start a new composition, now that you're familiar with sort of the lay of the land and how After Effects is broken down, basically. So we're going to go over here to New Composition. Now, you can do New Composition from footage, and what this does is it allows you to pull in some video footage that you might have recorded or gotten from somewhere, and then turn that into a composition right away. But I don't really like to work that way. I kind of like to start with a blank composition, and then I'll pull in the assets that I need as I need them, right? It's just like in Photoshop, you can drag a photo right into Photoshop and it will open up as a new Photoshop document. Or you can just start up a blank Photoshop document and then drag in things as you need them. It's the same concept. I kind of like starting with a blank slate and then I just figure out what I want. So I'm going to click on New Composition, and now this is where you get the specifications, right? We didn't get them earlier, and we talked about, why didn't we get the new document pop-up, but here we get it. So composition settings, so you can give the thing a name, right? And so I'm just going to call this one New York City, because we're going to do a really quick thing on New York City. Now, there are 3 levels of adjustments you can make: basic, advanced, and 3D rendering. Since we're just getting started with After Effects and we don't know a lot about it yet, let's stick with the basic. We want to make sure that we are working with presets. You can get in and fiddle around with the various adjustments here, but unless you know a lot about video, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. Now, if you have some experience with video and you want to play around with some of it, you certainly can. But I think the presets that are available here from the pull-down menu are pretty much a good way to get rolling. So the presets here are pretty much the way to go. So I always like to start with HD TV, of course, high definition television, 1080, 1080 pixels, of course, at 25 frames per second here, which is the frame rate, frames per second. Now, of course, we can learn more about these specifics as we go along, but just the basics of what we have here should be pretty familiar with you. So the pixel width is 1920, the pixel height is 1080. That is also very similar to standard web page dimensions. The aspect ratio is 16:9, which is widescreen aspect ratio, right? We are dealing with square pixels. The frame rate, like I said, is 25 frames per second, and it is full resolution, which is what we're going to be presenting here. Now, you can change the background from black to whatever you would like, but I generally recommend just leaving it at black. It's a good way to sort of get started. Okay, so once we've got that, you said go ahead and hit OK, and then now we have our new composition, and you will see that some of the elements in the workspace that were grayed out are no longer grayed out. Now we're ready to work. So remember, this rectangle here represents sort of our view screen, our television screen, our movie screen, however you want to imagine it. That is what's going to be showing you what's happening on the screen. The composition itself shows up as an asset over here in the media panel, right? So we named it New York City. That is the actual asset itself, so it works out pretty good, right? So your workspace, or if you want to think about Illustrator or Photoshop, your artboard gets its own asset over here. Now we have, of course, the layers panel has livened up down here at the bottom. You also got a whole bunch of controls here that have turned on, and the majority of the tools up top are no longer grayed out. They are ready to go as well. All right, so the first thing we're going to do, just to sort of show how the basics work, is I have some content over here in this folder of New York City. I have this photograph here of New York, and I also have a short 21-second video clip of New York, this one right here. So we're going to take each of these and we're going to drag them over here to our assets panel, to our media section. And I can do both at once. You can just group, drag and drop, but I'm just going to do one at a time just to sort of show you how it works. So you drop one of them over here, you get the little plus symbol, and it drops it in place. So now you can see if I click on the thumbnail of it, it gives me a little preview. It tells me the size of it. It's 1920 by 1280 is the original size. Tells you the name of the file. It's a JPEG, and it uses millions of colors, which is kind of funny. Okay, so now we'll go back to our collection here, and I'll grab that short video clip, drag that over here. And when you're dragging them over, don't try to put them on top of things. Just drag it into the dead space, all right? And it will automatically assign it. You'll notice that there was a little progress bar that popped up really quickly. That gives it time to sort of process it. Depending on how fast your computer is, it may take a little longer or a little shorter period of time. But since we're dealing with shorter clips of video here, it shouldn't eat up too much. So now this here, of course, is the busy street in New York is the name of the file. It's an MP4 video file, also 1920 by 1080, millions of colors, blah, blah, blah. You'll see that the bottom of the thumbnail here has a audio wave form, so it shows that there is audio attached to it, so that's good. On these recordings, you may not hear a lot of audio just because of the way the screen recording works, but there is audio here. Now, I have this sorted by name, and I can reverse it, so it's alphabetical or reverse alphabetical. I can sort them by type, so the composition always stays at the top. I usually do this. I usually alphabetize it from top to bottom, right? So from B to B in this case, and then I'll organize it by type so that the composition is at the top. I generally always like having the composition up top of the list for no real reason other than I like to keep track of it. As you keep adding more assets to your media pile here, this will get longer and longer and longer of a list, and it'll eventually make you start scrolling. So I like to have my composition just sitting at the top, right? Okay, now once I've done that, now that they've gone from my computer, from my computer's file system to After Effects, to the media pile, now I can drag them for a second time, one by one, over to the composition itself. I can put them on the screen, right? So I'm going to go ahead and grab this photograph and pick it up and just drop it into the composition. Now you'll notice that as I drag it, I'm keeping the mouse button pushed down here, that it has this kind of gray frame which is showing me the size and shape of the photo. And then you also notice there's sort of a bullseye or a center point, crosshairs in the middle. That shows me the center of it, okay? And then as I drag it, as soon as I get close to the edge of the composition window, it snaps into place, which allows me to center it perfectly. Now you'll see that the photograph, before I even let go of it, you can tell that the photograph is too tall for the video space. That happens. It's okay. You don't have to go ahead and crop your photos in advance in Photoshop so that they're the right proportion or anything like that. You can just drag them over and they're going to live behind the mat around the outside, just like in Photoshop, right? How the photos kind of disappear. So once I've got it centered, I can let it go, and you'll see that that photo is now dropped into place in the composition. Looks really nice. I can still see the edge of it beyond the view screen. And you'll notice something else that happened is that photograph not only went from my media pile, from my asset pile, to the composition screen, but it now gets a layer down here in the layers palette. So it does two things. It adds it to the composition screen and gives it a layer in the layers palette. Pretty great, right? So now it's kind of ready to go. Now let's take a look at what it did to the layers palette before we come back up here and sort of play around with it. Now let's talk about clicking, because that's kind of important. So your selection arrow should be your default tool at all times, just like in Adobe Illustrator, right? In Illustrator, I always tell people, use your black selection arrow, and when you're done doing something, click in some dead space and it will deactivate everything. right now, this photograph of New York that I dragged in is active, right? It has a bounding box around it. See the bounding box? So I want to make sure it's inactive. So I'm going to click out here in the black space, and then you'll see that the work area gets outlined, but the photo is no longer active. Now I come down here to the layers palette and notice that there's a bunch of different things on the layers palette. The first thing you should recognize on this particular layer is the eyeball tool, the visibility tool. If I click that, you'll see that it just disappears, right? And as you know from your experience with Photoshop, it didn't really disappear. It's just hidden temporarily, right? And then, of course, there's the name of it right here. Now, this is the file name, right? But what if I want to name it something a little more memorable? Well, I can simply click on it here, and then that will take me into that layer, which allows me to sort of take a closer look at these details, right? This is the new layer viewer, which pops up as a tab over the composition. So along the top here, you'll get different tabs depending on what you're looking at. So since I double clicked on this layer, it gave me the new layer viewer, which gives me some options, things I can do, etc. When I'm done with it, I can X out of that and go back here. Now, if you right click on the layer, you can see that you get some options. You can add effects, you can add masks, you can adjust the quality of what you're looking at. There's some transform tools, including rotation. I can adjust opacity. If I want to make it kind of see-through, I can do that. There's a whole bunch of different things. We will get into these later on as we go, naturally, but I just want to let you know that the right-clicking on the name of the layer brings up the contextual menu, which gives you some options. The one we're looking for, of course, is rename, which turns this into an editable space, and then I'm going to basically say NY Empire State, because we're looking at the Empire State Building here. And then once you're done renaming your layer, hit return on your keyboard, and now it renames it. So just like in Photoshop, you can rename your layers. Now, there's a bunch of other tools along here, which we're not going to get into right now, but we'll get to those later on. Now, the really important thing here with the layers is just to the left of the color coding. Each layer gets color coded, and you can change the color coding by simply clicking on the colored square and assigning it a different color. These, of course, are for organizational purposes. You know, the more complex your project, the more layers you're going to have, and so you want to stay organized. This is also a tool that exists in Photoshop. You can color code your layers. But just to the left of that colored square is a fold-down menu, and then that starts giving you a list of the sub-layers that are associated with that object, and that's where you can start putting in effects and whatnot. The one that's already pre-built into all layers is the transform sub-layer. And if I fold that down, you'll see that there are a bunch of ways in which you can transform it. You can create an anchor point, you can adjust its position, you can change the scale, you can rotate it, and you can adjust the opacity. Now, you can do it as a single instance, or you can do it over time. Remember, this is time-based media. So in Photoshop, of course, you could adjust the opacity simply by dragging down the opacity. So now I'm bringing the opacity of this picture down to 15%, and you can see up here that it's pretty transparent, and I can see the black background mostly through it just by clicking and dragging it. I can also bring it back up to 100. Pretty straightforward. But what I did there is just adjust the opacity in a single instance, meaning that it applies to the opacity of the photo through its entire existence. It has nothing to do with time. The main thing we want to do is, of course, do things that are in relation to time because it's video. So this brings us to the idea of keyframes, which we're not going to learn right now, but all keyframes is basically a point in the timeline where something starts, and then the next keyframe is the point in the timeline where something ends. You give it a beginning point and an end point, and then within that frame of time, you assign some kind of transformation. So that's the basics of it. We'll deal with that later. Okay, next, outside of the transform, let's fold that back up. Let's look at the timeline over here. So you'll see that the timeline that's associated with this photograph is kind of this bluish speckled bar that just runs in time here. Now, to play your video, all you got to do is hit the space bar on your keyboard, and you'll see that there goes the timer. It's moving along, And of course, nothing's happening because we're just looking at the same photograph sitting in one place. But this gives you an idea that now 12 seconds, 14 seconds, 16 seconds, 18 seconds, and so on and so forth, over time, this photo is just going to live in existence. Now, to stop the time, I can just go ahead and hit the space bar and it stops. Now, this right here is referred to as the playhead. That shows you where you are in the timeline. I can manually drag it around. Notice the unit of measure up here, the ruler, that is in seconds, right? And 34 seconds, 38 seconds, and so on and so forth. So that's pretty straightforward. And it will just go on and on and on as long as you need it to. Because this is a photograph, there is no time associated with it, right? Okay, next, let's drag in another piece, okay? I'm going to go over and grab my New York video that we got here, and I'm going to pick that up and drop it into the composition too. Now, this, of course, is the right proportion because it's already a video, so it sticks to the 16:9 ratio. So I'm going to make sure I fit that in nice and tight in the center and let it go. And so there that is. Now, you're probably wondering what happened to my New York City photograph, right? Well, if you look at the layers, which layer is on top? The video is on top, and the photo of the Empire State Building is on the bottom. So what does that tell you? What do you remember from Photoshop, right? So it's covering it. But first, let's go ahead and rename it. And right-click, rename. We're going to call it NY Taxis, because it's a whole bunch of taxis cruising through the city. If you've ever been to New York City, you know that there's a whole bunch of taxis all the time. Okay, so if I wanted to see my New York photo, remember, I could just reorder the layers just like you do in Photoshop. So that's exactly the same. So if you're familiar with layers in Photoshop, that part should be the same to you. Now, let's look at the timeline for the video. You'll notice that the timeline for the video, this kind of greenish speckled line, only goes to, boom, here, somewhere between 20 and 22 seconds. So it's like 20.5 seconds. So that means that if I pull the timeline along, you can see the cabs moving through the streets, blah, blah, blah. Notice that the view screen gets pixelated while I'm doing this because as you're moving, it switches to low resolution so that it can move quickly. So don't worry about the pixelization. It is a high quality video. It just doesn't show you the high quality while you're doing this. And then once I get to the end of the video, boom, it's gone. And now we are just seeing the photograph. Because within the timeline, that video of that New York street only exists for 20 some odd seconds, whereas the photo can go on and on forever. Make sense? So if I were to go ahead and run the video, I'll bring the playhead back to the beginning and just hit the space bar on my keyboard and let it run. And there you go, comes to an end. Now, what if I didn't want the video to start at the beginning of the composition? Well, these timeline bars can be moved. So, for example, I could pick this up and drag it over to here to the 6-second mark. And so let's say I want that video of the cabs to not start until we're 6 seconds in, right? So now I can bring it back to the beginning and go ahead and hit the space bar. And you'll see that we just get our nice stagnant picture of New York City, and then boom. It moves to the video. Pretty straightforward, right? Now you can use your imagination and kind of figure that, well, if I'm going to keep dragging in photographs and video clips and whatnot, I can arrange them in the layers palette so that they are in the appropriate order I want them to be within the Z-axis. But then I can move them within the timeline to appear and disappear at certain times. Now you might think, oh, I'm stuck with this photograph of New York the whole time, but really you're not, because even though it assigns a photograph or a still image to the entirety of the timeline, I can actually grab the end of it with this double-sided arrow and have it start a couple of seconds into the composition. So I'm going to move this back to 2 seconds. And we'll leave the video here. So the video of the cabs starts at 6 seconds. The picture picks up at 2 seconds. So what happens when I go back to the beginning of the composition? Blackness, right? Nothing, because my background is black. Now imagine that over this blackness I have some typography, right? We can get to that in a minute. So now if I go ahead and hit the play button, black, 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 New York City photograph, a couple more seconds, staring at the Empire, and then boom, we're into the video. All right, so now the basics of this should be starting to come together for you, right? Pretty straightforward. Now, what if I want to grab my type tool? I can go up here to the type tool. Now, at this point, I don't really need to explain what I'm doing because you've used the type tool before, right? You know what you're doing. So let me click and drag out a type box and start typing what it says, right? So we can say, welcome to New York, and then I can go ahead and add some styling to it, right? Go ahead and make it a thicker one, and we can change the size of it. There you go, a little bigger. And we can put its placement somewhere else. And there's a lot more typographic adjustments I can make, but you get the idea. I'm just doing this really fast. And then when I'm done, click over here and go back to my black selection arrow, and boom, we're done. So now I've got my little title here at the beginning, and you'll see here that as soon as I started typing, look what it does. Creates a new layer, right? Pretty great. So there's my Welcome to New York layer. So that lives up top here. And then do I want that to live through the whole thing? Maybe. As of right now, the type goes all the way across the timeline. Let's see what that looks like. Hit the space bar. There you go. That stays in front. Get to the video, stays in front. Now, what if at a certain point in the video I wanted the Welcome to New York typography to disappear? Well, that's easy. I can grab the end of the timeline for the type and I can drop it off, say, right here. And then at this point, you'll see that that red bar that associates with the typography will disappear. Now let's see what happens. Go. There we go. There's the photo. The video will be coming in next. And then a couple seconds into it, that typography is going to disappear. Boom. And in no time at all, we have a really basic composition. I'm going to turn the volume down here so we don't hear the noise so much on the video, so I can talk over a little bit more. But you can also have the Welcome to New York start a second into it. So let's say we have that go here, and we're going to start the photo a little later. And at this point, I'm kind of just like playing jazz, right? I'm sort of just moving things around, trying to decide where I want things to start and end. Now remember, these are not keyframes. We haven't learned that yet. What we're doing is we're just adjusting the beginning point and the end point of the timeline entries for the different layers, okay? Layers work just like they do in Photoshop. Type tool works just like it does in Photoshop or Illustrator, so all that's familiar with you. So now I can scrub through, which, by the way, when you grab the playhead and start pulling it, this is referred to as scrub through. So you can do a little quick preview, right? See what's going on. And then I can hit play, and let's see how this goes. There's Welcome to New York. There's my photo. There's my video. And then in a second, boom, there goes the typography. And so on and so on and so on. And now we can start building our composition. So right now, hopefully your imagination is starting to think, wait a minute, I could make a documentary. I could do something for a news show. I could make a music video. And that's right, you can do all those things with this. All right, so that's it for the introduction to Adobe After Effects. Just the basics, nothing fancy, but I want you to start dragging in some media to After Effects, whatever you can find, and go out to places like Pexels and Unsplash and those other places we've talked about, and grab yourself some video clips and some photographs and just start messing around.